remind you again of what a brutal, unleavened society. When I say unleavened, I mean that the Christian faith had not spread very far, and it hadn't exerted what people have called a leavening influence on the world. And so, the Roman Empire in Jesus' day, and even before that, remained a pretty brutal place to live. The Romans' policy, and it wasn't different from the Babylonians or from the Assyrians or the Syrians or whoever was the current power in charge in the Middle East, their policy was, if you want to be part of our kingdom, you have to acknowledge our king and our gods. Period. So if you cooperate, pay your taxes, acknowledge the king, acknowledge the gods, then you're going to be okay. But if you don't, then the hammer comes down. The hammer. Gee, that reminds me of Judas Maccabeus, whose nickname was the Hammer. And about 160 years before Christ, the Maccabees revolted. The people of Israel you have to understand a little bit of history. The people of Israel had come back from exile into their own land, but they were still under the thumb of the Babylonians. And they wanted to have their own kings, their own worship and everything, but they couldn't do it. And so, after the Babylonians passed away and Alexander the Greek conquered the world, take notes on this, because this is definitely Jeopardy material, I'm telling you right now. Alexander the Great conquered the world after the Babylonians passed away. When Alexander the Great died, he left 4 generals in charge, and those 4 generals wanted to spread Greek culture because they believed that Greek culture was the best culture there was. And so they outlawed any religions. They didn't allow people to follow their own gods, and the Jews were a little bit upset about that. And so they went into towns, and I was going to read you this long thing, but there are children present, so I think I may not read these accounts from the book of Maccabees. But the Romans would come, I'm sorry, it wasn't the Romans, it was the Syrians, Antiochus, would come into a town and say, okay, get rid of the synagogue, you're going to eat pork, you're going to sacrifice a pig. They would make them do that because they know that it was odious to the Jews. And then you're going to cook the pig and eat it, and you're going to say that you're going to only worship the Greek gods. As you can imagine, for people that were Jewish, this was a no-no. And they were upset about it. But at the point of a sword, what are you supposed to do? So there was present on this occasion a guy named Mattathias, and he was very angry about having to sacrifice a pig and worship the Greek gods. And the Greek people that were there trying to get them to do this said, look, if you don't do it, you're going to be killed. So a Jewish villager stepped forward to do it. And Mattathias and his 5 sons came forward and killed the guy, and then ran off into the hills and started a rebellion that culminated after much, much, much bloodshed and many years of trying to get free from the Greek influence, culminated in them actually getting independence for a couple of years. And they finally recaptured Jerusalem and took it over again. And let me read you something that happened here in Jerusalem. It says, this is when Judas Maccabeus, who was the leader of the Maccabees, came back to Jerusalem. It says, Maccabeus with his men, led by the Lord, recovered the temple and the city of Jerusalem. He demolished the altars erected by the heathen in the public square and their sacred precincts as well. When they had purified the sanctuary, they constructed another altar. The sanctuary was purified on the 25th day of Kislev, the same day, the same month as that on which the foreigners had profaned it. The joyful celebration lasted for 8 days. It was like the Feast of Tabernacles, for they recalled how only a short time before they had kept that feast while they were living like wild animals in mountains and caves. And so they carried garlands and wands and branches with their fruits, as well as palm fronds, and they chanted hymns of praise to God, who had helped them to triumph with Judas Maccabeus in the purification of his temple. Scholars think, now Judas Maccabeus was a warrior, and I was going to read you this long account about how he struck off the head of one of the opposing generals and stuck it up on the city wall and cut off his hand and displayed it and hung up his body. I was going to talk, because Judas Maccabeus, the hammer, there was a reason why they called him the hammer. And that was the kind of person that they were singing praise to with palm branches and garlands. And there are a lot of scholars who think that when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on his donkey, not his war horse, that the people were waving the palm branches because they're thinking, wow, in their perspective, this was like the Civil War for us. So they're thinking, wow, maybe there's another Judas Maccabeus here. Maybe finally someone is going to rise up like a warrior and kick out the Romans. And they were waving the palm branches just like they did for Judas Maccabeus. And a lot of scholars think when they were chanting the Psalms, that they were chanting the same Psalms and the same scriptures that they chanted for Jesus. Because their hope was, here it is, liberation finally. Of course, Jesus proceeded to sorely disappoint those expectations. In fact, some people think that the reason why they turned on him so quickly is it became apparent that he was not going to be Judas Maccabeus. He was not going to raise up an army. And so, because their expectations were dashed, they turned against him. The leaders, of course, were against him before that happened, but largely, the people turned against him as well. They were expecting one kind of king, and they got another. And isn't Judas Maccabeus kind of the king that we want? One who leads us in triumph, in the triumph of our party, our nation, our way of thinking, our denomination maybe. Of course, we don't do that anymore either. We don't have warriors so much, but they used to. We want a leader like Judas Maccabeus who's going to stand up and take back what has been taken. And that's not what Jesus is about. It's not what Jesus is about. And I think sometimes, even today, we get that mixed up. There is another kind of king. Jesus rode into Jerusalem as well, just like Judas Maccabeus did. Only Judas Maccabeus rode in on a war horse. Jesus rode in on a donkey. And like the little film clip said, it was clear that when you rode on a donkey, you came in peace. You weren't coming to start an insurrection. I'm thinking about that show. Who was watching that? Tom. Said something this morning about resurrection. I'm thinking, whoa. Jesus didn't come to start an insurrection and raise an army and cast out the Romans. He had a different kingdom that he was about. He rides on a donkey, not a war horse. He speaks of peace and not war. He has a different reputation. He's a healer of lives, not a taker of lives. He heals the blind to see, not to remove their heads so that they never see again. He wants to conquer, it's true, but he conquers by the sword of his mouth. Remember in the book of Revelation, I've got to read this to you because this is a wonderful thing that I think we get mixed up a lot. Revelation chapter 2, verse 16. This is Jesus speaking to the churches. And he says, repent therefore, otherwise I will soon come to you and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says. Jesus is going to conquer, but he's not going to conquer by a literal sword. They already went through that in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus put that behind him. Jesus is going to conquer by the words of his mouth. The sharp sword that it says in the book of Revelation comes out of the book of his mouth. Jesus also is different in that his vision goes way beyond national Israel. Jesus' vision goes way beyond just the people of the Jews living in their country in the Middle East. Jesus had much bigger plans than just to restore them to their country. The Old Testament lesson, which Tom read for us, makes that clear. This is everywhere in the Old Testament And yet sometimes people tend to miss it. It says like this, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle, and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim. I will take away the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth." His kingdom is not a warlike kingdom, and it's not confined to the land of Judea. It goes to the ends of the earth. Jesus has a much bigger project in mind than what people thought when he came. The question is, what kind of king do you want? Jesus came to be a servant king to the whole peoples of the whole earth. That's what he came to do. He came to speak peace to the whole earth. What kind of king do we want to serve? Jesus rides the donkey, not the war horse. Jesus is the servant king, not the warrior king. When we come to the sacrament every week, it reminds us of those very things. This is our king who gave up his life. This is our king whose body was broken and whose blood was poured out. This is the king that we celebrate. This is the king that Christians have always said that they follow. And I would invite you today, when you come forward to receive the Lord's Supper, that you bring your palms as an affirmation of praise for the salvation of this king and for the kind of kingdom that he came to found in our lives. Let's close in a word of prayer.